Well, good morning, everybody. After a busy day yesterday, a couple of videos, I think. Well, actually, one of them was officially first thing this morning with Millbilly. Thanks to Millbilly for joining us. And I was pleased to see Eric Ozee do his video last night about Saul Kassin suggesting why the Supreme Court should take Brendan's case. And I was up very early this morning based on Woody Woodpecker's observations. She suggested that my teeth were in a terrible state. Surprise, surprise, went to the dentist today. The dentist said that they're absolutely fine. I wonder if Woody has been lying about other things or just misrepresenting things. Anyway, enough about Woody Woodpecker, Woody, and just stating the lies and Tess Sanders. They are completely irrelevant now. Kathleen Zellner marches on whether they like it or not. And, you know, if to those three, if justice for Teresa is top of your agenda, get behind Kathleen Zellner. And that's exactly where she's heading. Anyway, let's quickly carry on with the next part, hopefully the second part of this article by Saul Kassin. Well, actually, an interview of Saul Kassin. We got to the part where, in order to set up an experiment on false confessions, he'd set up a computer. He told people to take notes on it, dictation, but not to hit the Alt key. There was no need to hit the Alt key. And when it crashed, they were accused of having done something to cause it to crash, and as in hitting the Alt key. In fact, it was all a setup. Anyway, let's carry on with the next paragraph. Some students ended up believing they really had caused the crash, coming up with explanations such as, "I hit the wrong key with the side of my hand." Now, so deeply had some of them been internalized of their guilt that some refused to believe Saul Kassin when he actually told them the truth. Another detective told Saul Kassin that during an interrogation he didn't actually lie about the evidence in hand, but said he expected new, potentially incriminating evidence to come in. For example, an interrogator might tell a suspect that they were waiting for lab results on DNA from the crime scene. You might think that doing so would get the innocent to deny the crime more vehemently, because they expected the results to absolve them. However, Kassin had interviewed exonerated men who said the prospect of new evidence had a surprising effect. Some confessed just to get out of the stressful situation, figuring that the evidence would later clear them. They think their innocence is their ticket out of there. And of course, that's exactly the case with Brendan, isn't it? He thinks that Steve's statement is going to be different, and that is going to be his making up is going to be a bit like his teachers at school. He makes things up, he guesses at things, they correct him, and then he carries on. And that's exactly what he was expecting in this situation. Kassin and a colleague tested such police bluffs in a variation of the computer crash experiment. This time, in addition to causing the students this time, instead of accusing the students, the experimenter said that all the keystrokes had been recorded on the server and would soon be examined. The false confession rate soared. Post-experiment questionnaires revealed that many of the bluffed students, like the men Kassin had interviewed, signed a confession to get out of the room and assumed they'd later be cleared. In that sense, Kassin says, belief in one's innocence and faith in the legal system can themselves be risk factors. Social scientists worldwide have repeated variations of the computer crash experiment with similar results. But critics have questioned Kassin's findings because the crimes his subjects were charged with could have been simple acts of carelessness committed unwillingly, and because confessing bore no serious consequences. Joseph Buckley, president of John E. Reed and Associates Incorporated in Chicago, the company that copyrighted the Reed technique in the early 1960s, adds that Saul's Kassin studies lack validity because they were not conducted using professional interrogators. Buckley says false confessions occur only when interrogators don't closely follow procedures. In a January report, Buckley said the Reed technique isn't meant to force a confession. Instead, he wrote, its goal is to create an environment that makes it easier for a subject to tell the truth. Well, this is interesting because I even asked Charles Darwin, Ken Kratz, is there any articles, any books, anything that says that false confessions don't occur? So here we have somebody fighting back, as it were, on behalf of the coercers of confessions. Work by other researchers has answered some of those criticisms. Social psychologist Melissa Rossano of Roger Williams University in Bristol on Rhode Island designed an experiment in which volunteers were asked to solve a set of logic problems, some working in groups and some alone. The researchers stipulated that under no circumstances should anyone assist the students working alone. Beforehand, however, a few students were coached to become visibly upset. That prompted some of their classmates to help in violation of the rules. In those experiments, the helpers could not have committed the crime without knowing, and confessing carried some consequences because cheating violated the college's honour code. But just as Kassin found, accusatory questioning often provoked false confessions. Rossano also tested another component of standard interrogations, the minimization technique that lowers the emotional barrier to confessing. She and colleagues would say things such as, "You probably didn't realize what a big deal this was." That technique increased false confession rates by 35%. Other researchers, such as Gisli Gudjonsson, a former Icelandic detective who became an eminent professor at King's College London, have shown how some individuals are especially susceptible to such pressure. Factors such as mental impairment, youth, and substance addiction make people quicker to doubt their own memory and, under pressure, to confess. Gudjonsson found Law Professor Richard Leo of the University of San Francisco in California reported that fewer than 20% of US suspects invoke their Miranda rights against self-incrimination, perhaps hoping to appear cooperative. He and social psychologist Richard Ofshe, then at the University of California, Berkeley, also described persuaded confessions in which a suspect, worn down by hours of interrogation, goes into a fugue and begins to believe their own guilt. The problem is especially pronounced among adolescents like Burton, who are both impressionable and cowed by authority. Much of the Reed technique involves watching for verbal and non-verbal signs of deception, something many police investigators think that they are skilled at doing. Kassin put that confidence to a test more than a decade ago. He recruited the best liars he could find. No, not a group of lawyers, a group of prisoners at a Massachusetts penitentiary. For a small fee, he asked half to tell the truth of their crimes on video and the other half to lie, saying they had committed somebody else's crime. He showed the videos to college students and police. Neither group did particularly well at truth detection. The average person is right about half the time, but the students performed better than the police. Yet the police felt more certain about their conclusions. That's a bad combination, Kassin says. Their training makes them less accurate and more confident at the same time. A poster in Kassin's office at John Jay College shows 28 faces: men, women, adults, adolescents, white, black, Hispanic. Look at how many different types of people there are. All of humanity, Kassin says. And what they have in common is that they all gave false confessions. There's no one kind of person who can give a false confession. It can happen to anybody. Kassin has helped many of them. Defense lawyers and human rights organizations around the world often call on him to analyze confessions or testify about the nature of interrogation. Sometimes as a paid consultant or witness, sometimes pro bono. One face on the poster belongs to Amanda Knox, the US college student studying in Italy who was coerced into confessing to the murder of her roommate. Kassin's reports to Italian courts were involved in getting her freed. He testified for John Cogut, a Long Island man who, after an 18-hour interrogation, falsely confessed to raping and murdering a 16-year-old girl. DNA evidence had won Cogut's release after he spent 18 years in prison, but prosecutors retried him on the basis of the confession. Kassin's 2005 testimony helped acquit him. Then there was Barry Laufman, a man with the mental capacity of a 10-year-old who in 1987 confessed to raping and murdering an elderly neighbour after police falsely told him they found his fingerprints at the scene. After his confession, the police disregarded all other evidence. Neighbours who offered alibis for Laufman were told they must be mistaken. His blood type was B, but the only blood at the crime scene was type A. So the forensic expert proposed a novel theory that bacterial degradation could have changed the blood type from B to A. Laufman spent 16 years in prison until DNA evidence finally cleared him. And Kassin later testified when Laufman sued the state. To Kassin, Laufman's case showed that confession doesn't just trump other evidence, but can corrupt it as well. After a confession, alibis are recanted, witnesses change stories, police ignore exculpatory evidence, and forensic scientists reinterpret material. In Hugh Burton's case, for example, police had caught a neighbour with a history of violence driving the dead mother's stolen car, but they did not consider him a suspect because Burton had confessed. The magnitude of the effect emerged in 2012 when Kassin and colleagues published an analysis of 59 false confession cases from the Innocence Project. 49 of those also involved other mistakes, such as eyewitness errors and mistaken forensics, a far higher proportion than in non-confession cases. In 30 of those cases, the confession was the first piece of evidence collected. In other words, once the police had a confession, all the other evidence lined up to support it. That has an ironic effect. Even when confessions have turned out to be false, appeals courts have ruled that the other evidence is strong enough to support the conviction, Kassin says. The courts completely missed out that the other evidence was corrupted. Other groups have shown experimentally how a narrative can shape forensic evidence. One dramatic example came in 2011 when UK psychologist Itiel Dror and US DNA expert Greg Hampinkane tested the people you would least expect to be affected by bias. DNA specialists Dror and Hampinkane obtained the printed DNA results from a rape case in which a man was found guilty. The original genetic analysis had been told that police had a suspect in custody. The forensic experts then determined that the suspect's DNA was part of the crime scene sample. To see whether knowledge of the arrest caused bias, Dror and Hampinkane gave the printouts to 17 experts unconnected with the case and told them nothing about the suspect. Only one of them matched the suspect's DNA to the crime sample. Such findings support the increasingly popular idea that all forensic science should be done blind testing, conducted without any knowledge about the suspects. Sometimes a confession will override even untainted DNA evidence. In the infamous Central Park case, dramatised in the new Netflix series, 5 teenagers confessed after hours of interrogation to brutally beating and raping the jogger in New York City. They quickly recanted and none of the DNA recovered from the victim was theirs. Yet 2 jurors convicted them after the prosecutors explained away the contradiction. She, well, we know who that was, came up with a theory that a 6th unidentified accomplice had also raped the victim and was the only person to ejaculate. The unidentified co-ejaculator theory has been used in other wrongful convictions as well. 13 years later, the man whose DNA matched the sample, a convicted serial rapist and murderer serving a life sentence, confessed that he alone had committed the crime. How could such an injustice occur? Kassin and a colleague published a study in 2016 in which they simulated the situation with mock jury experiments. When presented with a simple choice between a confession and DNA, people would choose DNA, but if the prosecutor offered a theory as to why the DNA contradicted the confession, the juries overwhelmingly sided with the confession. An insight, he says, into the power of story to influence judgment. Change is coming. By 2010, the evidence about how interrogations can go wrong had become so compelling that Kassin and several colleagues from the United States and United Kingdom wrote an American Psychological Association white paper warning about the risk of coercion. They suggested several reforms, such as prohibiting lying by police, limiting interrogation time, recording all interrogations from start to finish, and eliminating the use of minimization. They also said the practice of seeking confessions was so inherently damaging that it might be necessary to completely reconceptualize the tactic and come up with something new. One model comes from England, where police did away with their Reed-style interrogation system in the early 1990s. After several false conviction scandals, police there now use a system designed to identify deception based not on visible signs of emotional stress, but on cognitive load, which can lead liars to stumble as they try to keep their stories straight. English police conduct the kind of open-ended interviews that journalists might use and are encouraged not to go after confessions. Several other countries, including New Zealand, Australia, along with parts of Canada, have adopted the new method. They also record the entire interrogation to make the process transparent, something that 25 states have also adopted. And of course, if that was the case in Brendan's case, they would never, ever get a story that they could go with. They simply cherry-picked certain bits of his confessions, so-called confessions. 2 years ago, one of the largest US interrogation trainers, Chicago-based Wicklander Zalowski and Associates, stopped teaching accusatorial interviews and embraced the non-confrontational methods Kassin and his colleagues advocate. The company was influenced by the proliferation of research and a desire to minimize false confessions, says Dave Thompson, Vice President of Operations. We realized there's a better way to talk to people today than the way we talked to people 20 or 30 years ago. Kassin sees progress too. In March, he spoke to a group that until recently might have been hostile to his message. 40 district attorneys from around the country who want to learn to avoid wrongful convictions. Well, isn't it nice to know that there's 40 district attorneys there out of, I believe, 2,400 district attorneys in the whole of the US that want to know a little bit more about it. Clearly, Ken Kratz was not one of them. My point with them was that they are going to be fooled. That confessions that look real can actually be false, even if they're corroborated by informants and forensic science, he says. I wanted to let them know that alarm bells should go off when they see a confession case. Okay, so that was, as I say, that was the second part of that document by Saul Kassin. So what to do now is, as I say, I wrote to Saul Kassin. Oops, sorry about that. Just a brief message. Dear Dr. Kassin, greetings from Scotland. I have been following with great interest the plight of Stephen Drizzen and Laura Nyrider's client, Brendan Dassey, who is of course featured in the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. As you may know, Brendan Dassey came very close to being exonerated based solely on his coerced confession being overturned. I have been looking for any case where someone was actually successful in getting their conviction overturned in similar circumstances, i.e. without the assistance of DNA evidence or any other form of evidence. In one case I read, it stated that the Hugh Burton case was the very first example of an exoneration based solely on the science of false confession. Is this true? Are there other cases? Thank you, new in advance, etc. I'm just going to move it across to this side here so that I can read the next bit. So Saul Kassin wrote back, thank you to Saul. Dear Mr. Capaldi, over the years, false confessions have been discovered in several ways. DNA testing, which launched the Innocence Project in 1992, represents the newest method, but there are other ways that these cases have been discovered. For example, the discovery that the confessed crime never occurred, the realization that the confessed crime was physically impossible. Here's a good one, the apprehension of the actual perpetrator. Interestingly, the first wrongful conviction on record in the US involved two men in Vermont in the 18th century who confessed to murdering a man who went missing. Both were convicted. One was set for execution, then the victim turned up alive. I don't know if it's fair to say that Burton's was the first ever exoneration based solely on the science. What did happen in that case is that the DA's office, having considered all the evidence, maintained that Burton was guilty based on the confession until we met and spoke and they read the relevant science. The Burton case was astonishing in many ways that are common. The Burton case was astonishing in many ways that are common, including the fact that the likely actual perpetrator was known to police before Burton was convicted on the basis of his confession. I've attached a couple of articles you might find interesting. Saul Kassin. So he has sent me four different articles which I will get round to looking at over the course of the next few weeks. In the meantime, we've still to finish off the Steve Drizin and Richard Leo false confessions in the post-DNA world. So, well, we'll catch you again soon. Bye for now.